great privilege to be able to host John Lehman and our distinguished panel for the launch of his new volume, Oceans Ventured, Winning the Cold War at Sea. There's a famous line of Richard Nixon, which I don't think John will mind me quoting. Anyone can be Secretary of the Navy. Hell, we've got John Warner. But in fact, John made the job into something more serious, perhaps than been any time, as somebody's pointed one naval historic by anyone since time of Josephus Daniels, and of course his role in the 600-ship Navy, and now what we know from some of the Soviet archives that were released during the brief period of liberalization, the importance of what he was doing with the naval strategy, particularly in the Arctic, Barents Seas, and many other parts of the world besides. And it's a sign of the importance of his testimony, his history, come memoir, that we've been able to secure this distinguished panel at short notice. Kori, known to many of you, Deputy Director of IISS, experienced in many national security positions in the United States in recent years, and also, of course, shared connection with John McCain and their participation in the funeral obsequies for the deceased American senator in recent weeks. Also particularly privileged to have back here two good friends of policy exchange, Lord Robertson, former Secretary General of NATO, again experienced in these matters going back to the period when John was Navy Secretary, and Admiral of the Fleet, Lord West, who's needs no further professional expertise, needs no further enumeration here. So John's going to talk for 10 minutes first, then all our other panelists, then throw it open to the floor, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. John, thank you.
Well, first, having one of the most distinguished naval persons of the recent decades introduced as needing no introduction reminds me of the time I said that to my boss, Henry Kissinger. At the time, I introduced him that way, and afterwards he took me aside with a very grave look, and he said, "Lehman, don't you ever do that again." He said, "Don't you understand that those of us who are introduced as needing no introduction are the ones who crave it the most?"
Absolutely. You're with it. You're with it.
So if you'd like to
Start again.
Well, the question of I'm often asked is, why did I write this book? The reason I did was nobody else did, and it is a tremendously important story. And the reason no one else had written this book is that most of the key parts in it were classified, and unless you make a major effort, they stay classified for 30 years. So it took me about 10 years to get the key things that needed to be declassified out.
But there's something wrong with the sound system. Could you fix it?
We are I think we're aware of it.
And the other reason I wrote it was that, as Kissinger often says, history does not repeat itself, but it very often rhymes. And we are in a position where history is indeed rhyming with the period of the 70s, and so we can talk about that later, because I believe there are real lessons in here for what we should be doing right now, given the different kinds of threats we're facing. So the book is really the story of a fundamental difference in perception in the West of what strategy should be. First, for much of the Cold War, we had just one simple strategy, and that was containment. But gradually, as we in the United States went through the Vietnam War, and then immediately after the crisis of Watergate, there was quite a drift in and lack of confidence. As it is, there's a natural tendency in NATO, in the bureaucracy of both NATO headquarters and Schake headquarters, to focus on the central front, the North German plain, the Fulda Gap, the land balance. And it has been, since the Second World War, dominated really by a constant focus on trying to improve the balance or negotiate force reductions or whatever. Of course, the Soviets were very happy throughout the Cold War with the land balance. They had 180 divisions active along what we called the forward edge of the battle area, so to speak, in central the North German plain. And NATO never had really more than 40. We were able never to deploy more than 40 divisions. So the NATO answer was flexible response, which was a nice euphemism, but it was a totally unbelievable strategy. And the argument within NATO was, well, will it take the Soviets, the Warsaw Pact, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or 4 weeks to get to the English Channel? And at what stage will we go nuclear and use, quote, tactical nuclear weapons? That was the heart of it. Well, we can't match them on land strength, so we'll have to balance that with the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Well, of course, the Soviets never believed in any distinction between nuclear weapons, obviously because NATO tactical nuclear weapons, many of them were going to land in the Western Soviet Union. So the difference between strategic and tactical was they did not believe there was any fire break. And so it was inherently a non-credible strategy, and it gave a steadily growing confidence to the Soviets that the Western powers would not, when they were forced, if the Soviets used their land imbalance, that the Western democracies would never go nuclear, that the Soviets would be able to move not quite to the Channel, but almost to it, and then negotiate. And we did. We'd have to negotiate. So a kind of defeatism started to pervade NATO, to oversimplify. And there was a growing skepticism by many strategic thinkers in the West, both here in the UK, in France, and in the US, that this is really deeply wrong. This is, when you look at a map, you got the Warsaw Pact as a land island with essentially no warm water ports, most of their land above the 50th parallel, which is lousy agricultural land. They were buying 85% of their foodstuffs from the United States and Western Europe. And surrounding them were the 70% of the Earth's surface covered by water, in which the NATO powers were historically and up to that present time the most powerful, experienced, and professional navies. And none of that was factored into the real strategic thinking in Brussels. And so a growing body of strategic thinking in the press, of course, a lot of it fed by the Navy, was that we're disregarding this tremendous potential geographic advantage that NATO has, and the fact that the NATO navies can be used to neutralize the perceived imbalance created by this great overhang of land power in the Central Front. And but this just was, until really Ronald Reagan came along, this was very much of a minority view. Kissinger was a strong advocate of it. And as a result, which is often forgotten, is that the first 600-ship Navy proposal came in President Ford's final budget, which was a lame-duck budget and wasn't taken all that seriously because President Carter had made it clear that he did not believe that there was a role for the Navy except to keep the Atlantic Bridge open. And so in the first year of the Carter administration, and reinforced in the second year, the Navy's budget was cut and the allocation was put over to the land forces to strengthen the tank numbers and the strength of the land forces. And that, of course, was not well received in Congress because at the time, Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, had a very strong naval faction led by Scoop Jackson and John Stennis. On the Republican side, John Tower, John Warner, and many others. So during those years of the Carter administration, Congress kept adding to the Navy budget. The key test came when Congress added a nuclear aircraft carrier that Carter did not want. And he vetoed for the first time ever the defense bill. And the forces, the pro-naval forces, came within 2 votes of overriding that veto. But then the following year, they were able to override it, and they added not just the carrier, but an increased number. Well, anyway, during this period, Ronald Reagan was very, very focused on the issue. He spent a lot of time traveling in the years leading up to the 1980 election. He spent several trips here, became very good friends with Margaret Thatcher and the people, the defense advisors around Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Schmidt in Germany, some of the Japanese leaders, and of course Lee Kuan Yew. Spent a lot of time, and he read deeply in the Realpolitik school of academic thought with Robert Strauss at Pei and Sam Huntington at Harvard and Henry Kissinger. And so by the time he ran for president, he was very much seized of the need to change NATO's strategy to a more naval, global strategy. When asked, as many of you recall, in 1977, when he announced that he was running, he was asked, well, what is your overall Cold War strategy going to be? And he said, it's really a very simple, straightforward strategy. We win and they lose. And that really was. It wasn't just a gimmick. And of course, it led the wise and the just to say what a cowboy he was. He didn't understand the complexities of international politics and so forth. But he really did believe it. He believed we could win the Cold War without fighting, by using the inherent power, geopolitical power that the West had, with much stronger economies, with the world's strongest navies, and all it needed to do was to apply that. And so that's what he did. So we in the Navy had kept alive a strategy, a forward strategy, even though it was never, during the Carter years, never really adopted or even partially accepted. But it was full-blown and fully budgeted and ready to go when Ronald Reagan ran for president. If you look at the Republican platform of 1980, it is built around the 600-ship Navy, 15 carrier battle groups, 100 attack submarines. It's all in the platform. He ran on that and he campaigned on it. And so when he won, he had a pretty good mandate to change direction. And he met with us during the transition, and he said, well, we're going to increase the Navy budget by 10% with this supplemental, and then immediately, as soon as we can get it fully costed out, another 15% increase on top of that. We are going to build a 600-ship Navy. We are going to build 15, we're going to make sure we have 15 carrier battle groups, 100 nuclear attack submarines, and the rest of the support. 2.5 marine amphibious groups. And so he really spent a lot of time going through it. It had been costed out, and it was submitted to Congress. But he said, what can we do to show them that this is not just politics and not just a rhetorical flourish, that this is a fundamental change of direction from a passive containment strategy to a forward strategy of active movement to end the Cold War. And then we said, the Navy said, well, we have a deal for you. And we said, look, for the last 20 years, NATO has had very large naval exercises every summer and fall. But for the last 20 years, they have been prohibited from sending anything larger than a small group of ships north of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, because that would be provocative. It would disturb the move towards détente, and it would upset the Soviets. So there were no large exercises north of the GI-UK gap for 20 years. So what we can do is, and we really thought this through exactly how we're going to do it. We can, when the exercises start in August, he was inaugurated in January 20th. I was at my desk and the other service secretaries 2 weeks later, which is very different from how it works now. And this exercise was going to take place in August. So without going into it, I don't want to tell you everything that's in the book because then you won't buy it. So the fact is, we had a very aggressive admiral that we put in command of the Atlantic Fleet, and a very aggressive Royal Navy anti-submarine deputy who really was the best in the world, and we fully had the plan fully worked out. When the exercise launched, 230 some ships, counting the ones in the Mediterranean related part of it, that 83 ships without making any announcement, would turn left in the Greenland Iceland gap and go north into the Norwegian Sea all the way up to the Barents, and would not only just be there, but start running mock attacks, mirror image attacks right up to the Swedish and the Soviet border to show that this was a new game in town. But I said to the president-elect, there's one little caveat. You can't tell the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And you certainly can't tell NATO. If it gets into shape, or if it gets into the 6,000 person bureaucracy in the JCS, it will leak. And it will then, there'll be requirements for studies and analysis, and 5 years from now, there might be a decision. So, and it's easy to do that because nobody in the Joint Staff except the Navy knows what the Navy does. And nobody in Schake has any idea what goes on ships, what goes on these exercises.
And long may it remain so.
and they don't ask. So the president said, okay, let's do that. So, but then he said, but what about our European allies? This has got to be a joint effort. And we said, don't worry, because the Royal Navy never tells the ministry anything about what they're doing, and the ministry doesn't really look very hard. So we can pull this off without a leak. And so sure enough, that's what happened. We went north. The first time the Soviets knew we were up there in the Norwegian Sea was Ace Lyons, the admiral, through intelligence, found that there was going to be a big exercise off Murmansk of the Soviet Navy. So he sent a flight of 4 F-14s, 4 A-6s, and 4 tankers, A-6 tankers, 1,000 miles from the Eisenhower carrier. And they blew through this exercise at 550 knots. And the Soviets couldn't believe it. They had no warning. They had no idea that they could see that they were carrier aircraft, so they knew They knew where it came from, but they didn't know the carrier was in the Norwegian Sea. And so, and just as a little vignette, we were all a bit tense about how they were going to react when we whizzed through their exercise. And so they launched everything. They sent every flyable airplane, every ship they sortied. And the first Tu-95, the big naval patrol bombers, came around the North Cape. We had an F-14 on the intercept and flying on its port wing, and the rules of engagement he'd been given are if the Tu-95 has a blister, waist blisters on both sides, like a World War II bomber, and they're mainly for taking pictures and other purposes, but they also have a 21 millimeter cannon that can be swung into position through an open slot. So the rules of engagement were if the F-14 pilots saw any activity in that blister that indicated they were mounting the 21 millimeter, that they would do a split S and get out of there right away. So listening in on the comms, the pilot said there's a lot of activity going on in the blister, and right now it looks pretty threatening. And then there was silence, and then he came back up on the comms and said, the crew has just taped up this month's Playmate of the Month on the plexiglass. So there was a certain amount there was a high degree of respect for between the navies. The Soviet Navy is very professional, and there was a lot of mutual respect. Anyway, we did that every year for 6 years. Every year it was improved. Every year we refined it. We did it in the North Pacific as well as the North Atlantic. We did it in the Eastern Mid, and we were showing them that they could not stop us, and they didn't. It finally culminated in '85. We put the carrier America, into Osfjord, and operated the full air wing, and running mock attacks right up to through the mountains, low level through the mountains, right up to the Swedish border, popped up, turned the IFF on so they knew we were there, and said, "Nanya," and flew back. And we now know through intelligence that they never once were able, and we put 2 carriers in the following year. We had, I forgot to mention, we had the Invincible as part of our attack force in Ocean Venture, the first one, and the Royal Navy participated, especially and most valuably of all, in the submarine, the ASW. And I don't want to steal my colleague's thunder here, but the Royal Navy nuclear attack subs are the best in the world. The crews are the best trained. They are able to do some of the neatest intelligence work that even I couldn't get declassified. So you'll have it declassified. And so it culminated in 1986 in the General Staff sending a démarche to the Politburo saying that we must have a treble of the budget for the Northern Fleet and the Northern Air Force, or we cannot defend the homeland for more than a week. And that just created a huge thunderclap in the Politburo, and it gave Gorbachev just what he wanted, because he knew the deep trouble that the economy was in. They'd had the nuclear meltdown. They had the collapse in the price of oil, and so he clamped down on the military and cut their budget, didn't increase it, and that led to a significant attempt at coup d'état, but that's another story. So we know now that it was a significant weight on the scale that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were bankrupted really by the attempt to keep up, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you very much. John, thank you very much. John is, of course, a great friend of the UK. I would like to call him an Anglophile. He went to Cambridge. I first sort of heard his name when I found my weapons officer in my ship had invited the Secretary of the Navy on board the ship while I wasn't on board there, because he'd been at Cambridge with him. Tim Boycott, sadly dead now, was a great friend of yours.
Yeah.
And I last met John in the New York Yacht Club when we were talking about similar matters. I had in fact just met the last Prime Minister to try and persuade him that we definitely needed to run 2 carriers just outside the Sofintel, where someone got into a lot of trouble that same year, actually, if you remember. But anyway, so it was an interesting discussion we had. I'm going to touch on a few issues in the book. It's a fascinating book. As an ex-Chief of Defence Intelligence, I was my blood ran cold a couple of times, because I thought, I'm sure we're not allowed to mention that. So there are a number of things that are in there that I was surprised at, and makes it even more interesting, and of course explains. So often one can't understand why certain things happen, because you can't release the information that showed what it was based on, and I find that absolutely fascinating. I also find fascinating that this maritime strategy, which has a huge impact you talked about, I think it did finally cause the collapse of the old Soviet Union. That tied together with also the SDI initiative, I think, and also the perception of the Russians of the Falklands War, where they just couldn't believe a Western country could do something like that. When you added all those together, I think these all had that huge impact. And that maritime strategy issue is an issue that's really going on in this country at the moment. For years now, we've had a continental strategy. Now it's quite clear we need a maritime strategy, global Britain looking around and what's happening. And there is a tension about that, and you see that from sort of Max Hastings' articles, who's very much a continental man, who doesn't like the thought of carriers and the maritime strategy. So this book is fascinating to develop what can be achieved by a maritime strategy. I'm very interested about the fact that we didn't tell NATO and things like that about going north. We absolutely didn't. I commanded the ASW striking force just after this, just fractionally after this, and the ASW striking group was crucial to the American striking fleet, because it sanitized areas before the striking fleet went into them. And at that stage, I think it's fair to say that we probably had the best ASW capability in the world. We have lost that, and I think that is something to really think about, because if one looks today at Russia, not the Soviet Union, but at Russia, they have got a number of very, very modern submarines, and they're using them and deploying them on a scale we haven't seen since the height of the Cold War, and that is very worrying. And it's worrying that we've lost some of that ASW capability. We certainly couldn't form an ASW striking group in the way we used to be able to, with all of the myriad capabilities, also using American capabilities and NATO allies to actually sanitize whole areas of SSMs. I thought it was very interesting, yet again, and John mentions the people mentioning, the survivability of carriers. This is an old chestnut. The UK last lost a carrier in 1942, and they fought all over the place ever since then. They are not vulnerable carriers. Anything's vulnerable if you get enough things at it, but that was the last one we ever lost. And always they're having a go at vulnerability of carriers. As John shows in this book, 2 huge nuclear carriers operating in Vestfjord. No bastard could find them. I've managed to go with a carrier battle group. No one could find you. You know, they are very difficult to find, and then very difficult to get sufficient forces to actually attack them properly. And I found that a fascinating part of the book. I also thought it did bring a smile to my lips that, as he mentioned, in April '82, Andropov, who was the chairman of the KGB at that time, said, right, we are to start active measures against Reagan's election campaign. Plus ça change, isn't it? Really, quite a fascinating readout, I thought. As John mentioned, we've been operating submarines with the Americans, and we're joined at the hip with them up in the Barents and up there for many years. And indeed, even when we didn't have nuclear submarines, conventional boats. But I'm trying to think what has been released intelligence-wise. Silent Deep mentioned it. You know, we even had conventional boats sitting on the seabed in the harbours in northern Russia, monitoring what was going on. That's the sort of thing we were actually doing at that stage. So we've been up there for a long time.
Even I couldn't say that.
But as John has said, we had not deployed a large group there. I spent the late 70s commanding frigates up in the Norwegian fjords and up around Kirkenes and up into the Barents Sea. But this was a small handful of ships, nothing serious, not like an American striking fleet, which has unbelievable power and capability. You know, this when one of these moves into an area, it's got 200-mile radius of where it controls totally the sea and the airspace, and because of the SW striking group, the undersea space as well. I mean, it is incredibly powerful, and those had not moved into that region before, and I think that's fascinating. I think the size of the US Navy then was very impressive. It did achieve this. Of course, the US Navy has tumbled down in size since then, and I think it's something we need to think very hard about, not just the US Navy, but our Navy as well, because when your navies get too weak, then I'm afraid people take opportunities, and it's more likely to lead to something unpleasant happening. I'm delighted we've got our carriers, but it's actually a disgrace how few other ships we've got, and I'm glad that the Americans are starting to build some more ships. They need to go, I believe, a lot further than that. And when one looks at you know, Putin sitting there with the Syrians and with the Iranians, trying to show that he's actually organising Middle Eastern affairs, and then you find he's doing a huge exercise with the Chinese out in the Far East. It does make you realise we've got to actually think very clearly of what our strategy is and get our act together. And I think John's book is very timely, makes us think about what can be achieved in this, and I think a very, very useful book. And John, the final thing I want to say is thank you very much indeed for what you did at the Falklands War before President Reagan could take any action, because the state and I&R were faffing around as usual. John actually gave approval to release sidewinders to our Harriers, our Sea Harriers. The sidewinders he released enabled us to shoot down the Argentine aircraft. The sidewinders we had before, we found used to explode before they went in the tailpipe of the plane they were shot at. So you might get a little bit of damage, not much. The ones he released to us went right up the stovepipe, so it was goodbye bingo. So it was very good and allowed us to win. And John did that. He moved satellites. He did lots of stuff for us. And for that, I'm very, very grateful, John. Thank you very much indeed.
Anybody else going to yield their time to?
So when I was reading this smart, serious book, I had 5 reactions to it. The first was that it is often said that the United States is incapable of making strategy. We're such a loud, messy country, and authority is sprinkled between the Congress and the executive. And this book was such a beautiful reminder that dedicated leadership can produce effective strategy in really important junctures. And as I was reading it, I kept thinking, everybody's acting like math class is newly hard, but math class has always been hard, right? It wasn't easy to make the strategy that John Lehman and the Reagan administration made. It was no harder to make strategy, is no harder to make strategy now than then. It's just really hard, and it takes leadership commitment. It takes incredibly talented executives to force through the system the money, the dedication, the prioritization, and the consistent effort over time to make it happen. The second reaction that I had, as I was reading it, was how smart asymmetric strategies are, and we're not that good at that anymore. And I think of that every time the Russians do something provocative, we feel like we need to counter them with more tanks in the Baltic states. And I'm in favor of more tanks in the Baltic states, but what was so brilliant about the maritime strategy was they had the Russians running from provocation to provocation. They managed to come up with a strategy that forced the Russians, like the American cavalry on the Indian frontier, or like all of our militaries chasing after emergent terrorist threats now. They forced the Soviets into a reactive strategy, and that was both incredibly smart, and our national security priorities deserve better strategies than we're giving them now. The third reaction I had to it was, so Oceans Ventured, which was the name of the major exercise that Secretary Lehman talks about, was big and splashy and important for sending a signal. But what struck me as I was reading through the book was how important the day-to-day exercising and operations tempo and consistency of pushing back what the Soviets thought of as their exclusive sphere of operations, to remind them that they were under constant pressure, what we American baseball fans talk about as small ball. This strategy did brilliantly by constantly just keeping the pressure on them in places where they had to respond to. The fourth reaction I had reading to it, and I see the great historian John Bew here, who wrote an intellectual history of realpolitik. And I was thinking about your book, John, when I was reading this, because so much of the contemporary commentary about Reagan administration strategy, and so much of the caricature it has become in retrospect, has been to leach the subtlety out of it. And it wasn't just stupid and blunt, and it wasn't just a 600-ship Navy. There were lines of operations that had an elegance about them. And the way John Bew describes how realpolitik as a political approach has been leached down to nothing more than might making right. In both cases, there's a lot more richness in the history and in the ideology that merits us reflecting on, because in some ways the subtleties were as important to the success of the strategy as the big blunt force pieces were. And my final reaction when I was reading it was, what a brave, brazen choice it was in the strategy, not just to explicitly try and make the Soviet submarine nuclear force vulnerable, but to make clear to the Russians that you were doing it. Most people who worry about strategic stability among nuclear powers would have argued dramatically against doing that, right? It's crisis destabilizing. And that was such a central piece of what you're doing, and so bravely undertaken. It made me think about the importance of risk-imposing strategies. We in the United States, both in the Obama administration and in the Trump administration, tend to be hesitant to undertake strategies that would risk conflict or escalation with the Russians. And I noticed when the Russian mercenaries attacked US forces in Syria, that was one of the first times I could think of that the United States willingly ran a set of risks about escalation with the Russians in order to send the signal that we ourselves were not afraid of running those risks. We have been too deferential, and I believe it has encouraged Russian aggression to only be worried about the risks we are running, rather than adopting strategies that impose risks of escalation on them.
She deserves a lot of applause. I read this book, fascinated. You know, it's a bit of history where I was young and involved in simplistic politics. And it's an interesting story about how basically the Soviet Union was taken on, outspent, outmaneuvered, and eventually the Soviet Union was to collapse. And collapse through, in many ways, its own contradictions. I've always remembered the conversation I had with a former Warsaw Pact general, because you met them in NATO. A lot of them were meeting each other for the first time, Warsaw Pact and NATO officers for the same time. And this guy said, well, he said, you know, as part of the Warsaw Pact invasion of the West, we were supposed to take the south of France. And I kept wondering, how on earth was I going to keep the guys out of the bars? So sometimes grand strategy boils down to very simple things as well. So this is it's an interesting story. I read it because I'm preoccupied at the moment with the present situation, and therefore what lessons can we learn from this? Now I've got two sort of golden rules in politics. One is, it's not what you say, it's what people hear. And therefore I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you now. And that is, today, this is not your daddy's Cold War. It's something very different. And if we are to slip into the mindset that was available during the Cold War, then we won't win it. I'm not sure it's the terribly Cold War, it's the Chile War, it's the Chile conflict that we've got. The second principle, I think, in politics and in business is don't turn your opponents into enemies. The Soviet Union was an enemy. It had a coherent ideological base. It had a determination to world domination. It was powerful and it was strong. It was by any means a superpower. And it was an existential threat to our way of life. Russia today is not. Russia today, if you look at the view that Russia has of us, it wants attention, it wants respect, it wants to end the domination of America as the single polar power in the world. Now that is not world domination. They're preoccupied by their near abroad, Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, more than they are with any extension to the rest of the world. They have no transferable ideological base, no economic model that would in any way transfer or can be sold to anybody at all. So we need to think in a completely different way. And just as the Reagan administration, John Lehman, these people thought through how you could maneuver the Soviet Union in the way that eventually it did. Professor Sergei Karaganov has written an article in the last 2 weeks about how to win the Cold War, and he actually talks about the Soviet Union spending something near to 25% of GNP at the height of the objective by the Soviet Union, wrecking their own economy until eventually, when Gorbachev came to power, he had to deal with that unsustainable wallet. So it's got a weak economy today, but what it does, and what we've got to be conscious of, is it goes for our soft underbelly. That's what the Soviet Union did, and that's what John Lehman and those people who thought through what was the Soviet Union's soft underbelly. And therefore, that's why they're involved in troublemaking in elections, in the Balkans, in the areas around Ukraine and the rest of it. And we need to be resolute, and we need to be strong, and we need to make an established virtue of the values that we actually stand for. I know maybe in the past I'm not defending past NATO bureaucracies, but NATO is a remarkable organization, actually tiny. As Secretary General of NATO, I had a full-time civil service staff of about 300 in total. That's all. The nations that make up NATO keep the internal secretariat very, very small indeed, but enormously flexible. Today is the 17th anniversary of the first invocation of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. 17 years ago, at this time, I was engaged in phoning around. The good Dr. Schake was my guest at dinner, but eventually I got to eating that evening. It took 5 hours for 19 nations to agree that Article 5 should be invoked because the United States of America had been attacked from outside there as well. So there is a flexibility. What we need to do now, you know, people, in a world where people say it's great power confrontation, you've got to work out, first of all, who are the great powers. Might not be Russia. It could well be China, whose trade we are all so desperately keen to get involved in. But you have to think big, you have to think strong, and you have to think inventively. As Kori has said, we need to be as imaginative as the previous generation was if we're going to be able to protect the way of life that we think that we know we have inherited, but we want to protect in the future.
So guests very kindly agreed to answer questions, usual house rules. No question too outrageous, you just have to state your name and organisation. Do I see any? Gentleman there. Name and organisation.
Thank you. David Nicholas, Staff of the House Commons Defence Committee. Two very quick ones I had. The first one to Dr. Lehman, just to ask, the maritime strategy was a global strategy. Why was it particularly the fear for the Norwegian Sea that was the appropriate pressure point in which to face the various layers, that's the right terminology. And secondly, Dr. Sharp very eloquently spoke about strategy and its constituents. What is the reason today why we have a problem with this? We seem to have a lack of this kind of direction of thinking. Is it a problem of government? Is it a problem of political and military relations? Or is it just a problem of ambition?
Thank you. The reason that the Norwegian Sea was the first priority was there were several contributors to it. One, there had been a growing sense of real fear in the flanks of NATO that this obsession with the Central Front was writing them off, both Turkey and Greece in Eastern Med, and Norway and all of Scandinavia in the North Atlantic. That was one important reason. We had to show that Article 5 meant a complete global strategy against the Soviets, not just going back into the difficult areas, but the adopted strategy was the swing strategy before Reagan. And that is, we don't need a big fleet because we can swing the Pacific Fleet around to reinforce the Atlantic Fleet. Totally strategically blind, because that freed up all of the all of the eastern forces of the Soviet Union and essentially wrote off Japan, our other allies, in a global war. So we didn't just do the Norwegian Sea, but that happened to be the most obvious and immediate opportunity to demonstrate this forward strategy. As soon as we could, which was about 6 months later, not even 6 months, but in January, we did the same thing in the Pacific off Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk. We did mirror image strikes. We did the same kind of demonstrating to them that they could not stop us from seriously degrading their strategic reserves, and that we denied them the possibility of moving their significant forces in the Eastern Soviet Union to reinforce NATO. Reinforce the Warsaw Pact. So, but perhaps the most important was that is where they were the most vulnerable. Their most important strategic assets were in the White Sea, Kola Peninsula area. and we wanted to demonstrate that they could not defend them, and that we could have the capability to really eliminate their most important SSBN strategic reserves and use that area to strike deeper into the Soviet Union. So those were the principal reasons, and we already had a ready-made exercise with 220 or 30 ships of all the NATO ready to go. We did not have that in the Pacific. But it also raised another point that Kori mentioned. We knew what the Soviets' reaction would be. We knew the rules of engagement. We were reading their mail. And we knew we had ground truth in how their command structures would work, how they would react to a given set of threats. And so the willingness to take the risk was somewhat ameliorated. And while all the bright commentators at the time said Reagan is crazy, this could start World War III, Reagan knew very well that it wasn't going to start World War III. And interestingly, one of the important, difficult debates we had was within the Navy itself, because the operators who were essential to you can write grand strategy and have kind of parades and exercises, but if you don't get out there and operate, it doesn't have the effect, it doesn't have the credibility. And we and the Royal Navy had some pretty cool secret technology, and the operators didn't want to reveal it because they wanted to keep their secret so they could surprise them when the war started. But our argument, to oversimplify, but it went in many directions and deeply. We basically said, look, we have got to show our stuff. We've got to reveal just how good we are, and we've got to demonstrate how our kind of jamming systems can work. We kept the coolest stuff secret, but we had to really put a lot of the goods out on the table there, which upset some of the operators. The second part of your question.
Strategy. Why we so bad at it now?
Because strategy comes from senior leadership. The Royal Navy has always had terrific anti-submarine strategy and submarine offensive strategy. But to tap into that expertise requires leadership, political leadership at the top that recognizes how to use it. Kissinger always says that diplomacy is simply the shadow cast by military and naval power. And too many of the political leaders in NATO and the United States don't understand what is there, what can be used, and that is the biggest lack we have. We have good strategic thinkers in the services. So far, we don't have the leadership, and I'm not talking about any particular individual. By the way, you should know that we have a firm rule in our house that anybody who mentions the T word has to put $20 in the wine fund. And we are drinking much better than we used to.
So my answer to your very good question would be that the threats haven't actually been sufficient to compel our attention until recently. That the West, by which I also mean Australia, Japan, South Korea, I mean the liberal democracies that undertake responsibilities towards each other. We have had such a luxury since the end of the Cold War, and even with the terrorist threats that we are dealing with, where our margin for error is so enormously wide that I get all school teachery and indignant whenever any Secretary of Defense, including the current Secretary of Defense, writes in their strategy that the world is just so much more complex than it ever was, because Franklin Roosevelt would love to have the problems of the contemporary American president. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, they'd love to have these problems because we are strong, prosperous, for the most part safe, ensconced in a group of friends who hold hands and help each other solve their problems, as the international support for Britain after the Skripal poisonings, I think, is the most recent wonderful example of. We're only now starting to get scared again. The rise of China, the decline of Russia, and the way Russia is trying to antagonize the West, because Vladimir Putin has concluded he cannot be successful on Western terms, and therefore will not allow Russia to be successful on Western terms. The national security strategy that the Trump administration put out and that got carried over into the national defense strategy is the first time the United States has actually been willing since 1991 to acknowledge that we have returned to an era of great power competition, and we need to gun up for this. We need to get serious about the undertaking because our margin for error is thinning.
I would add to the issue of the threat, and I agree entirely with that. The fact that actually we don't, and I'm talking about the UK here, we don't actually know how we perceive ourselves. How do we see ourselves? Do we see ourselves as global power? Should we be actually saying, because the Americans have helped us to get decades in Europe, we absolutely will help you in the South China Sea, we'll help you in the Far East, and as we talk about a carrier group going there, this sort of thing. We have no clear perception, I don't believe, exactly how we see ourselves in the world. And when you've got no threat as well, and you add those two together, it's extremely difficult to get a sensible strategy.
Judgment there for that. Naked organisation.
I'm James Kivner from Improbable. We're a technology company doing simulation in this field. I came to it from Whitehall, so I've sort of seen from both sides. Fascinating story, riveting. Clearly, we all buy the book and read it. But can you share? It's a story with a happy ending. We got the outcome we needed. But can you give us some insight into what the most kind of adrenaline-fueled moment was on that journey? Because you didn't know it was going to turn out the way it did.
It's a great question.
Yeah. Well, much has been made of the panic attack that the Soviets had in 1983 when Andropov had triggered a sudden fear and mobilized the KGB and the GRU and all of the embassies to report, because he feared that the West, with this aggressive forward strategy, constantly doing training for mock attacks into the Soviet Union, were really planning a first strike. And that the reason they feared that, and it was taken up by the military, was because that's exactly the way they planned.
Right.
They always thought that, and you saw this, by the way, in the Middle East war, when the Egyptians and the Syrians, coached by the Soviets, kept doing exercises, running right up to the Israeli borders and back, and until finally the guard was down. And then the next exercise, which was billed as an exercise, they kept going. And that is classic Soviet doctrine. So they feared that we were doing that. That fear, that they really did fear a first strike, never really made it into the senior decision making, because I have to say, thanks to the fact that our intelligence the technical intelligence, the West has always been lousy at human intelligence, so it's always much better than us. But we have usually, and still do, I believe, have a far better technical intelligence. But because of that, we knew, and we knew that they knew at the senior level, that we were not planning a strike. So I have to say, the tensest moment was when that F-14 pilot thought they might be mounting the 21 millimeter. There were no real tense moments. None of us in the administration thought that the Cold War would end as soon as it did, but we did have the confidence, and certainly President Reagan had the confidence, that there was no escaping for the Soviets and for the Warsaw Pact, that they were going to lose, and it was not going to end in war. And maybe that's just in hindsight, but I don't remember losing any sleep ever during the administration.
Gentleman there in the middle.
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Crane, Perpetual Films, formerly of the BBC. This is a really, really interesting talk for me because when I was at the BBC in the sort of early mid-80s, I made a television series called Submarine, which was about the Royal Navy's submarine service. And that included spending 2 weeks on HMS Warspite during the ocean safari exercise, which you probably remember. So it's very interesting to hear the kind of the other end of that. What I wanted to ask you, it's a slightly parochial question, but forgive me, is clearly back then there was massive cooperation between the Royal Navy Submarine Service and the US Navies. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how and whether that's changed, whether there is less cooperation for whatever reason, and if so, why, and whether that's a bad thing?
Well, I'd really be interested in Lord West's view of this. My own view is it is just as close as it's ever been. The problem is there are fewer people to get close to. That's the shrinkage of the Royal Navy is a matter of real concern because the Royal Navy, for the U.S. Navy, plays an invaluable role because, kind of like the Israeli armed forces, being smaller, they are more agile, they are more flexible in their thinking. The Navy, by its very size, the U.S. Navy, is more ponderous in its thinking and its ability to move. And all through the Cold War, the Royal Navy was an innovator it really was an essential lobe in the naval brain. I mean, all of the innovations in aircraft carriers came from the Royal Navy, the canted deck, the Fresnel lenses, and that was because they just, being smaller, had a more innovative and a less bureaucratic ability. So today, in my judgment, I don't know who's in the audience, so I'll probably get in trouble, but I think the only real professionals, equal and in some ways superior, in some ways a little inferior, but real peers in the professionalism of naval warfare, there is only the Royal Navy and the French. And we see both of them shrinking. Unfortunately, the Brits faster than the French. And it's got to be stopped. We have to have a joint strategy that recognizes the whole purpose of defense spending and defense strategy is deterrence. It is to prevent war from ever happening. And this is the hardest thing, and the biggest disadvantage that democracies have is it's so hard to mobilize in peacetime the necessary ability to deter the disturbers of the peace. And we're much closer today to the power politics of the 19th century than we are to the 20th century. And I totally agree with Lord Robertson that that there is no reason that China or Russia, North Korea, different issue, Iran should be our enemies. They have become much more intrusive into our interests because we've allowed them to, because we've disarmed unilaterally. We have vacated the balance, the geopolitical balance. And so naturally, I mean, I remember I had several really interesting sessions in China with their top strategic thinkers in the Ministry of Defense and the Army, all, by the way, Cambridge graduates and USC graduates and Caltech, very well turned out in Italian designer suits, perfect English, very bright people. And they were very frank. They said, we're going to build a 600-ship Navy because you're disarming, you're abandoning. We haven't seen a carrier over here in 2 years. And you just created a vacuum here in the Western Pacific, and we are vitally dependent on the sea lanes, on the strategic straits of Malacca and Sunda, and we just can't afford to leave the vacuum that you've created. And that really was what started this. And of course, when you allow them to expand in such and build a kind of navy with aircraft carriers, nuclear subs, and so forth, then the appetite grows with the building. And we've allowed that to happen, and there's no need for it to happen. There's no inherent existential reason for China to attack the West. And the same with Russia. Russia, as John McCain always used to say, it's a gas station with an economy the size smaller than New York State. It's not a superpower except for its 15,000 nuclear weapons. That has to be taken into account. But they don't have the strength. If we don't have to break the bank to rebuild the ability to deter all of these different threats, because all we have to do is reassert the fact that we know how to do it, we can do it, and we will do it. And that is affordable even with the budgetary pressures that we all in the West face.
Yeah, the bottom line is we are as close as we ever were with their submarines. They're totally interchangeable. When they're doing special operations around the world, if an American submarine suddenly can't make it, they'll call up, one of ours will go in there. As John says, the problem is, whereas we were building up to 18 attack submarines in the 80s, we now have got 7. And that is a real problem because of numbers. When it comes to the ballistic missile programs, it's the new Dreadnought program, it's a shared common missile compartment. We're absolutely, again, totally joined at the hip. And when people talk about the special relationship, there's a lot of rubbish talk about that because every nation looks after its own interests. But actually, the real special relationship between the US and the UK is the intelligence field, where NSA and GCHQ, they're just almost the same thing. And half the people in America don't realise that. They're so close together. Similarly, in other areas of intelligence, and also in the military aspects, particularly of nuclear submarines and carrier aviation, which again is why the new carriers are so important. The Americans have helped us dramatically in that. We've had pilots flying off their carriers to keep going with the Harriers having gone. The Queen Elizabeth is now over there. A few drunken sailors, I admit that happens. And they're doing trials with the fast jets. That is the real special relationship. Let's not kid ourselves. And that is really close. And I have to say, I've been in 3 wars, and I'm always very happy when I've got Americans on my right fighting. And I think the Americans feel the same about us.
I can't help just telling a little anecdote about my friend John, my late friend John McCain, because he was attacked for last year in his defense bill. He had a significant increase for the Navy, and he was attacked on the floor by another senator who said, "You're trying to spend money like a drunken sailor." And McCain said, "Wait a minute, I've been a drunken sailor. I'm not spending money like a drunken sailor."
Let me just say another another word here. As I said at the beginning, it's often not what you say, it's what people hear. And I have a feeling, I'm an opposition politician, a former Secretary of State, I would like to see the defence budget increased. If we continually go on about our weaknesses instead about our strengths, then who is picking up that message? What Alan West has just said about the carriers, when they were in my defence review in 1998, they're still there and they're a very important part of it. That is a story that needs to come out and needs to be said. But I fear sometimes that if we continually go on and on about how weak we are at this time, then the people who listen are not just finance ministers, it's our potential opponents as well. We're actually a strong nation, and in alliance with the United States of America and the rest of NATO, we can take on pretty well everything in the world. I've got a sort of dinner time question I ask people. The defence budget of this country is $50 billion equivalent a year. What do people think the Russian defence budget is this year? The answer is 43 billion. They cut their defence budget last year. They focus what they spend it on, and they chalk up a lot of the rest of that as well. NATO European countries spend $300 billion a year on defence, and NATO as a whole with the Americans spends $1.2 trillion a year. We are formidable in the world today in terms of any of the opponents that we face at the present moment. We could be stronger, we have to be more imaginative, and we need to do more. But sometimes I still believe that we should talk about our strengths and not continually about our weaknesses.
Just a few more questions I'm going to tie together. Since lady there.
Thank you.
Name and organisation.
My name is Victoria Schofield. I don't actually have an organisation, I'm an independent writer.
But daughter an admiral, so you must be a decent chap.
Thank you. Yes, actually, I want to ask Dr. Lehman, it's very interesting, I haven't yet read your book, but while all this was going on, we had, of course, the landlocked, no navy, Afghanistan, and which was Gorbachev then subsequently called the commitment of the Soviet Union of leading wound. Could you put in context what was going on in Afghanistan with maritime strategy at that point in time? Because we all like to think, I mean, the short-term version is that the Soviet Union crumbled because of its commitment in Afghanistan, but what you're saying very clearly is that's not the case. And my second question is, should you more proactively put that maritime strategy into force now with China? Thank you.
Afghanistan, there are areas that as the Austro-Hungarians learned, to not necessarily depend on the seas. However, Afghanistan, after 9/11, when we went in to try to find Osama and did our first real operations there, all of them were based on the Kitty Hawk, on the aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk. The air wing essentially was taken off, and the special operations forces of the Marines, of the Army Rangers, and the air commandos were put aboard, and they operated because there was no available base close by in that time frame. They operated from Kitty Hawk. So, an aircraft carrier, we did the same thing when there was the crisis in Haiti with the John F. Kennedy. We took the air wing off, and we had to get 2 divisions of Army Airborne, and we loaded the carrier with 2 divisions and their helicopters and took them right to Haiti because there was no base to operate from on the land. So the ability, I don't want to get into the quagmire, intellectual quagmire of what we should or shouldn't have done and should do in the future in Afghanistan, because it's clearly not a model for good strategic thinking. But the fact is that if you command the seas, you can you have a lot more flexibility to reach areas that suddenly become vital, as and I couldn't underline more what Lord West said about the deterrent, the change in the Soviets, what they call correlation of forces after the Falklands, because they had written off Britain and most of Europe as not being willing to fight. And suddenly, there they were down in the Falklands in real combat. And of course, they couldn't have done that without a navy the size it was then. And I won't say whether they could do it today, but it's so naval power it cannot replace all other power. Certainly not land power and armies and all of the ancillary special forces and so forth. But without sufficient naval power and command of the seas, your ability to deploy and to support forces of the appropriate size anywhere in the world just doesn't exist. And the second part of your question?
Should you be more proactive in putting into effect the strategy for China?
I believe that China, the question was, should we be more proactive on putting a forward strategy into China? The 17 reefs, quote, bases in the South and East China Sea should never be a casus belli for us as such. But we should never recognize this claim, and we should continue to do what both the Royal Navy and we have been doing, and that is send warships through there on innocent passage to demonstrate that we do not recognize this spurious claim. I don't think it's necessary for us to do what we did during the Cold War in the Reagan administration and send task forces to run mock mirror image strikes against China. I don't think that's necessary. What we have to do is reestablish the presence, not just of the United States, but of all the free world powers, and especially our Asian allies with Japan and the Philippines and Singapore and so forth, to demonstrate that we can work together, we have capability, we have real flexible military capability, and that we can recreate a balance. That we don't have to really start practicing to go to war with China, because I think that would be a mistake. It sends all the wrong signals. And part of an important element of the Reagan strategy was sending signals, which was, yes, we are prepared to attack you, and we know how to do it. And watch us, here we come. There's no need to do that with China. That would be the wrong strategy.
Anyone else want to say anything? I think we're getting close to the witching hour. I'm sorry to disappoint anyone. Copies of the book are available at the back at some outrageously reduced price, but I think above all you want to join me in thanking. It's been a brilliant panel.